For today's lesson, we are going to be generating equivalent forms of rational numbers, including whole numbers, fractions, and decimals. We'll also be using ratios to describe proportional situations. So for the vocabulary, our first word is equivalent fractions. And equivalent fractions are fractions that have the same value. For instance, 1/2 and 2/4 are equivalent because 2 is half of 4 and 1 is half of 2. So these two fractions are equal or equivalent. We're also going to be dealing with simplest form, and a fraction is in simplest form when the GCF of the numerator and the denominator is 1. So if we have the fraction 1/2, we know that 1 and 2 are both in simplest form. There's no way that there is a number that would divide evenly into both of these numbers. It is as low as it can go. So we are now going to talk about some different methods of making fractions in their simplest form. So I need you to skip down to the part of your notes that says steps to solve. And it says here that there are several methods you can use to write fractions in simplest form. The first step that we're going to be dealing with is to multiply or divide the numerator and the denominator by the same non-zero number. So a non-zero number could be any whole number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, any whole number that you can think of except 0. Now, you're going to notice that you're going to multiply or divide the numerator and denominator. So whatever you do to the top, you've also got to match it on the bottom. So the second step that we're going to be dealing with is dividing the numerator and denominator by a common factor until the only common factor is 1. So you must have your fraction where no number will divide evenly into top or bottom. It is in the lowest form that it can possibly be. And our third step is to divide the numerator and denominator by the GCF. So we've talked about the greatest common factor. That would be a strategy to shorten the process involved here. So let's try out some examples. The first example that we have here is 21 over 24, 21 24ths. And we know that if we are dealing with 21 and 24, that both of those numbers can be divided by 3. So knowing that 3 is a factor of both 21 and 24, I am simply going to put a division sign and a 3 next to the top and bottom to remind me that whatever I do to the top must also be done to the bottom. So we know that 21 divided by 3 here is going to give us 7. And if we divide 24 by 3, that is going to give us an 8. And you're going to notice that 7 cannot be taken any lower than it already is. So since both numbers cannot be lowered at all by factors, the simplest form of 21 24ths is 7/8. So with using the same rules on this fraction, 9/15ths, let's see what the simplest form is. We know that 9 and 15 can both be divided by 3. So we list our divided by 3 next to both the numerator and denominator, because whatever you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom. we know that 3 will go into 9 3 times, and that 3 will go into 15 5 times. So no number will divide evenly into 3 and 5. So since nothing will work on top and bottom, we know that 3/5 is the simplest form that you can get out of 9/15. And the same thing applies to 36/45. We know that both of these numbers can be divided by 9s. So same number on top and bottom. We know that 9 will go into 36 4 times, and that 9 will go into 45 5 times. So since no number will divide evenly into 4 and 5, we know that 4/5 is the simplest form of 36/45. Let's give a couple of word problems a try, since you will be seeing a lot more word problems throughout the course of this lesson. So for our first word problem, you're going to see that in Mr. Rowland's class, 24 out of every 32 students own a scooter. Express the fraction of the class that owns a scooter in simplest form. We know that the first thing we need to determine is what we are solving for in this problem. And we know that it tells us they want us to express the fraction of the class that owns a scooter in simplest form. So, marking our keywords, we know that 24 out of every 32 students owns a scooter, and they want us to express the fraction of the class that owns a scooter in simplest form. So knowing that out of every tells us that we have a fraction bar listed, and we know that 24 out of 32 students owns a scooter. So we know that 24 own a scooter. If we want to simplify 24 over 32, we need to find the GCF of these two numbers. Now, we know that both of these numbers are even, so they could be divided by 2's to start us off. And we know that 2 will go into 24 12 times, and that 2 will go into 32 16 times. Both of my numbers are still even, so I know that any even number can be divided by 2 again. So 2 will go into 12 6 times, and 2 will go into 16 8 times. So I've still got even numbers here. As long as I have even numbers, I can always divide by 2. So we're going to divide by 2 again. And we know that 2 goes into 6 3 times, and that 2 goes into 8 4 times. No number will divide evenly into 3 or 4. So we know that our simplest form is that 3/4 of the students in Mr. Rowland's class own a scooter. Now, that problem could actually have been done a shorter way. I want you to think about what a shorter way of solving this problem could have been and be ready to discuss it in class tomorrow. Now, for our next example, they tell us that in a typical symphony orchestra, 16 out of every 100 musicians are first and second violin players. Express the fraction of the orchestra that are violinists in simplest form. So, we're first going to determine what this problem is asking us. And it is asking us to express the fraction of the orchestra that are violinists in simplest form. So, for the keywords, we know that 16 out of every 100 musicians are violin players. And they want us to express the fraction of the orchestra that are violinists in simplest form. So that out of every tells us that we're going to be dealing with a fraction. And we know that 16 out of 100 are violin players. So we know that 16 and 100 are two even numbers, like we saw above, which means that they can be divided by 2. So 2 will go into 16 8 times, and 2 will go into 100 50 times. Notice that we're dividing by the same number on top and bottom. This is the common rule you're going to see when you're simplifying fractions. Now 8 and 50 are still even numbers, so we could still divide by 2. So 2 goes into 8 4 times, and 2 will go into 50 25 times. So we're now to the point where no number will divide evenly into 4 and 25, which means that we have reached the simplest form of 16 100ths. So we know that 4 25ths of the orchestra play violin. Now, I want you to go onto our class Moodle, and I want you to journal about the lesson that we've seen today and be prepared to have a class discussion tomorrow.